So we're going to do some teaching tonight, an introductory bit of teaching on three thieves. And the three thieves are anxiety, fear, and worry. And I call them thieves because they steal. They steal our sleep, they steal our peace, they rob people of their health, of their total well-being, and they really ruin people's lives. And so I want to take some time to introduce the subject tonight. I have a book that we're going to be working out of for the summer. It's called Following the Eyes of Your Heart. And this is one that I wrote that deals with these three big issues, ancient issues that are in our lives, and it describes it. So if you're interested in actual study, you can go through that, okay? So Jesus said, do not worry. Sounds simple enough. Do not worry. He said it different times. And there's about 400 times in all of the Bible where it says, fear not. And Jesus said it at every turn. He said, don't be afraid. Only believe. And he also said, don't take any thought or any anxiety or be anxious for tomorrow. And we do. So he's speaking to a universal need. What he's talking about is for all people, everywhere, for all time. We all have issues with those three things, with anxiety, worry, and fear. And Jesus addressed it. And what I want to talk about this summer is how to resolve these things. They must be something we can get on top of. They must be something we can resolve. It'd be unfair of Jesus to say, don't do it, if we couldn't. It'd be wrong for him to say that. So when he said, don't do it, there must be a way that that's possible. And he'll never badger us, he'll never bully us, he'll never force us not to fear or not to worry. If we choose to, there's nothing he will do about it. He's told us not to do it, and he's even given us clues on what to do instead. But he's not going to come in and get a hold of us by the spiritual lapels and shake us and say, I told you not to do this, therefore you must not do it. He'll never do that. In fact, nobody can do that. Your partner, your parents, the police, your pastor, nobody can change how you think. Only you can do that. And so when he said don't do it, it has to be within the volition of the human will to be able to stop doing it. But it's a habit. It's something that we fall into. And we have to learn how not to do it. And so it's something we can be taught. What I want to do in this study is look for biblical solutions. There's lots of books on fear, lots of books on anxiety and worry, and lots of responses in society, like in medicine and psychology. There's lots of different responses to all three of these things. But the only thing I'm interested in is a biblical solution. I don't think anything else will really truly fix us or help us. And in fact, every time the Bible teaches about worry or anxiety or fear or depression, it doesn't give just one solution. It gives us a handful of tools that we can try at different times from different angles. And of course, there's degrees of depression, and there's degrees of anxiety, and there's degrees of fear. So some of the things that we can do, we'll manage it in the smaller degrees, and if it gets really intense and we have extreme anxiety or extreme fear, extreme depression, we may need some other things to help us. I'm not opposed to medicine. I'm not opposed to counseling. I've done a lot of that. Medicine is God's mercy. And if you need it, it's available for you. But it's not a solution. It was always meant to be temporary, to help you cope. If you're taking medicine to sleep or taking medicine to reduce your fear, that's God's mercy. But what he intended us to be able to experience is total freedom from that. And so it'd be wrong to say, don't do it. Don't take medicine. I think that's wrong. And so we just have to keep it in perspective. I think we need to step away from solutions, any kind of solution that doesn't require discipline. There's something in our nature that says, give me a shortcut. Give me a pill, or do a prayer, one-time prayer that gets rid of it once and for all. Everything I see in the Bible requires discipline. You have to change how you think. You have to respond differently. There are things that I consider dead-end teaching right in the Bible, or people taking parts of the Bible and they use it different ways. There are dead-end teaching, I would say generational curses, where you look back on, see what your forefathers did to understand what you're going through. If you want to go down that road, I'll wait with you. I'll wait for you by the gate, but I'm not going down that road. I've been there. Other people have been there. There's no solution in my mind. Plus, Jesus never taught that. Paul never taught it. He never wrote one letter to any of his followers saying, go back in your past and find out if Grandpa was involved in something bad, and if he was, that would account for you having problems with your thinking. It just doesn't make sense. And anytime we focus on treat it as something super spiritual, like that it's a demon of depression, a demon of fear, a demon of anxiety, a demon of worry. There's demon. I've heard people teach about demons of nail biting. You can go down that road if you want to. I think it's a complete waste of time. And so they do torment us, and it does happen. They're real. But anything that we're struggling with, we can find a biblical solution for it without having to go to those extremes. Clinical counseling, that's God's mercy. And the only problem with clinical counseling that I see is biblically we are a spirit who lives in a body, and we have a soul. We're a three-part being, and all those parts are so interconnected that if you touch one, it affects the other. And usually they don't understand how man is made, and so they deal with everything as a physical problem. They'll say it's a disease, or they deal with it as a mental problem, and they'll give you a pill for it. They don't necessarily see it spiritually, and they don't understand how we're made, and so the Bible does. And so that's one of the keys to finding our way out of these things, so we can help ourselves and help other people. I just said a minute ago that if you touch one part of us, it affects the other part. Jesus said that there's days coming in the days ahead, in the last days, that are going to be so confusing and so terrible that men's heart would fail them for fear. In other words, they'd have a heart attack because of fear. So what Jesus is saying, without him explaining it, is there's a correlation between our emotional well-being and our physical well-being. If something touches you emotionally, it can affect you physically, and vice versa. And so we're interconnected. We are a very super complex being, but the Bible addresses it in very simple terms. During the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant was fatigued by battle. He was battle-worn. He just wanted the thing over with. It was an intense period in his life. He had a migraine headache that wouldn't go away. He was depressed. He was completely discouraged because of the conditions of the war, that it just kept going on and on and on, and they just couldn't seem to bring it to an end. And he was in really tough shape. He had a migraine and depression that just like a fog that filled his brain. And then at one moment, a soldier rode up on a horse and handed him a note, and instantly the migraine left, and instantly the depression left. It never came back. And the note said, "Robert E. Lee would like to meet you for terms of surrender." In other words, he had physical issues, he had physical ailments, but something came in an instant, changed that. Isn't that interesting? That's exactly what Jesus is talking about. Here's some facts about all three of these things. We'll say four of them. There's anxiety, and there's degrees of that. Worry and anxiety are often interchangeable. There's fear, and then there's depression. And so I'm calling it three thieves, but we can break it down into four. All of them, each of them, operate on the same basis. And what applies to one will apply to the other. If you can master one of them, you can master the other, because all the principles of depression, all the principles of fear, all apply to anxiety. They're all the same. They all function the same. The more creative you are, the more likely you're going to have a struggle with these three things. There are people, they say, well, he's too dumb to even worry. Well, there's some people, it's not that they're dumb, they just don't think that way. But if your mind is really quick and sensitive to all kinds of things, and the eyes of your heart are really cultivated, where you're visionary, if you're prophetic, those things require faith, and those things require seeing things with the eyes of your heart. And anytime you're really good at those things, it's very likely you'll also have an issue with fear. You have an issue with anxiety and depression, because it's the same mechanism. You're actually seeing something with the eyes of your heart, even if it's into the future, worrying about what's going to come. The only reason you can do that is you have the ability to kind of look ahead, or spend too much time in the past. You have a strong imagination. I notice with kids who have a very strong imagination, they also have lots of fears. And it's just a good thing that's getting hijacked and being used against them. And it wouldn't take much to train them to recognize when it's happening, recognize that it's not some outside being, it's not something physically wrong with you, and it's not something mentally wrong with you. It's something that happens, and they can change it. They have the power to change it. People who have strong faith usually have strong fears. And the reason is all fear works by faith. You're actually believing something. You're believing that something's going to happen, something bad is going to happen. You can picture it. And you're actually putting faith into it, believing that it's going to happen. And that creates the feeling of fear. If you didn't have faith, you wouldn't have those feelings. Your faith just needs to be redirected. You don't even need more faith. Just use the very faith that causes you to believe that, boy, if I do this, something bad's going to happen. You just take that same faith and say, no, when I get there, God who's with me today will be with me there. That's taking the same faith and just redirecting it. David did this a lot. He'd say things like, whenever I'm afraid, I will trust in you. In the King James Bible, it says, what time I'm afraid, I will trust in you. And that's a profound thing. He's actually saying, I'm going to take the faith that it takes to fear, and I'm going to put that in trust in God. It all works the same way. In fact, trust is the key to the whole thing. If you could just trust the Lord with the future, trust the Lord with your past, trust the Lord with whatever's making you afraid. If you could just trust the Lord a little bit more, because you have a faith that He loves you and He cares about you. The Apostle John, he said the reason that we're afraid is we don't really believe that God completely loves us. And he was saying it as an absolute truth, an emphatic statement that if we have fear, we're not complete in love. And we're going to talk more about that as we go. The feelings of fear, and that's what they are, is they're feelings. The feelings of fear come whenever you believe something that's not true. When you believe something that's true, you'll get a feeling, and it's called peace. You'll know in your heart that's true. the feeling of fear always comes when you believe something that's a lie. And there's just many, many stories in the Bible, in David's life, in Abraham's life, in Paul's life, in the disciples' lives, where they actually believed something that wasn't true and they screamed their heads off or they became frightened. And then the truth was revealed for what it really was. Another one, in terms of deep, deep sorrow, we just went through Easter, and I noticed Mary Magdalene at the grave where Jesus was early in the morning, Easter morning, and she was just sobbing. She was beside herself with sorrow. And she turned, and there's a man standing there who she thought was the gardener. She didn't realize it was actually Jesus. And she said to the gardener, "Tell me where you have taken him, and I will go get him. Sir, what have you done with him? Tell me, and I'll take him. I'll take his body." And she said this with deep, deep sorrow, because she believed, you could see her actually picturing somebody coming and taking the corpse of Jesus, someone that she loves, someone that she cares about, and taking him, and she doesn't know where they've taken them. Well, that would create sorrow, except none of it was true. She had all the feelings, but none of it was true. Nobody took the corpse of Jesus. And Jesus is standing there, but she can't recognize him. And he says her name. He says, Mary. And he said it in a way that she's always heard it before. Just that when he says your name, he says it in a way that no one else says it. When she said that, she said Rabboni, or Rabbi, and immediately embraced him. And we see that little picture, something profound, that she had deep emotional sorrow, but it wasn't based on something that was true. And that happens an awful lot. There are people who draw conclusions that something bad is going to happen to them, or something bad has happened to someone that they love. And they go through an emotional roller coaster. And then they have this enormous relief when they find out that it isn't true. Isn't that interesting? The feeling of depression, I'll give you these notes, by the way, you don't have to write them down. The feeling of depression always comes when we impose a negative from the past onto our future. We say, that's happened to me before, and that's what's going to happen again. You will experience feelings of depression. They always follow. And it's all the way through Scripture, and it's true in your life. If you stop and trace your feelings back, it'll always go back to a thought every time. Sometimes I can do that even years afterwards. I have the feeling of fear, and I can trace that feeling back to a thought. If I can look at that thought and say, now, is that really factual? Is that really actual? Is that really going to happen? Do I know the future? Or am I concluding that God doesn't care about me, and He won't be there, and He won't look after me? Well, if you conclude that something bad that's happened in the past is that's all you have to look forward to in the future, you will be depressed. It's a feeling that follows that line of thinking. And once we have the feeling, we need to say, okay, now I have that feeling. I'm going to have to change what I'm thinking about. In fact, let me just state this emphatically, just as clearly as I can. It's not a reasonable goal to try to live our life without fear, or without ever getting depressed, or without a day's or minute's amount of worry. They're not reasonable goals. Nobody lives that way. What we do, and if that's your goal, you'll be defeated very, very quickly. So for me, I realize that freedom isn't not having these things. It's not letting these things run me into the ground. It's not letting them take over my life. It's recognizing them early, stopping and saying, okay, I'm feeling afraid. What am I thinking about? And what am I thinking about that's not true? And if we just stop step back for a moment and say, okay, now I have feelings of fear. What is it that I'm thinking about? Rather than saying, is it a demon? Is it something wrong with me mentally? Is it something wrong with me physically? Stop and consider what you're thinking about. And if you can do that, you can always, always, always trace it to one thought. And then you handle the thought. And the thought says that something bad is going to happen to you in the future. Well, do you know the future? No, none of us do. James made it really clear that we don't know what's going to happen. Our life is a vapor. It's fleeting. You don't know the future. Even if you said, well, I'm a bit psychic. Well, then you'll be a lot wrong, because they rarely get it right. I get a chuckle out of reading about psychics going bankrupt. Well, didn't they see that coming? Well, even if you knew the future, for example, God actually visited Moses and said, today you're going to die. And it's interesting to see Moses' response. He didn't fall apart. He didn't drop to the ground. He didn't have a fit. He didn't become angry. When God tells you, and it's a matter of fact, and it's Him telling you that this is what's going to happen, when He says it, you just have this amazing peace. It's like it's okay. If God says it, then it's okay. And His words convey what's in His heart. And what's in His heart is peace. You'll feel peace. There's a number of people in the Bible that He told them that their time was up. And so if He told you the future, if He told you something was going to happen, you wouldn't be falling apart with fear. You'd have peace. The feeling of anxiety comes from thinking too far ahead, and we're told by Jesus not to. He said, there's enough trouble today. Don't be thinking about the future. He tells us not to worry about the future. The future will take care of itself, but you've got enough today. I think what happens with people is they're looking with regrets in the past, and they're mulling over every mistake that they've ever made and every bad thing that anyone ever did to them, and that's depressing. And then they start thinking about the future, and they just take all that negativity into the future, and then they struggle with depression and anxiety and worry. Jesus said, try to live in the moment. Try to live for today. And we find out through Alcoholics Anonymous and through every counselor who finally is really trying to help people, that if we can get people just to live in today, you can manage today. There's grace for today. You're doing all right today. Today's not a bad day. But when you start living in the future, everything changes. And Jesus says, don't. Here's one thing that He said to His disciples. He said, look, the fact is, persecution is going to happen to you. If it happened to me, it's going to happen to you. He said, men are going to arrest you. That's a fact of life. He said, but don't premeditate. Meditation is revolving around in your mind. Don't premeditate what you're going to say. He said, here's what you do. You wait for the moment, and then the Holy Spirit will give you exactly what to say. But don't waste any time. Don't waste any energy. Because if you think, well, this is what they're going to do, and when they do this, this is what I'll say, and this is how, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe I should say this. Next thing you know, you're completely undone, completely overwrought, full of anxiety for something that hasn't even happened yet. He said, just don't do it. There's grace in the moment. In fact, there's grace in the moment for all of us, but we actually forfeit that grace because we're thinking too far about the future. Isn't that true? Today's actually a good day. You can get by today. You can get through today. Today's not that bad. But if we compound it with tomorrow and the next day and the next day, plus all regrets of everything we should have done and we didn't do, and we wish we had done, and what they did bad to us in the past, you'd just be emotionally a wreck. Jesus said, don't do it. All the solutions to everything I'm talking about are simple. They're not easy, but they're simple. They're so simple, a child can do them. That's the most marvelous thing about Jesus' teaching. Everything he said was simple. Not necessarily easy, but easier than anything you can think of on your own, any solution you can come up with. And so we have to keep that in mind. These are feelings. They're not physical. They're not physical in themselves. They always start with a thought. I want to also just finish this up by a few things that the Apostle Paul dealt with. The Apostle Paul was very realistic, so he often talked about his own fears. He had fears that he struggled with. David had fears. David had depression. David had anxieties and wrote about it. So Paul had, he's in prison and they can come in at any moment and take his head off with a sword. He doesn't know when he's going to get out. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And in the middle of it, he writes to a church and he says, don't be anxious about anything. So he's telling them not to be worried. Well, he must have resolved that battle in himself. He must have had the opportunity to worry. In fact, he did. There was a time when he was standing before a tribunal. He was alone. There's no Greenpeace, there's no lawyer, there's no UN, there's no consulate help trying to get him out. Nobody cared, and he said, my friends all forsook me. So if you can imagine, he's standing before these gray-faced men who don't care if he lives or dies. They don't know that he's the great Apostle Paul like we do. He just looks like a homeless man being brought out of a prison. He's filthy, he hasn't shaved. He's just this little man, and they have the power to take off his head. They have the power to throw him to the lions. They can do anything they want with him. So he would have opportunity to be anxious, depressed. His friends took off on him. He's brought out into the light. He's chained hand to ankle. And there's all these stone cold faces that don't care about him. They don't know him. And then he said, all of a sudden, Jesus stood beside me. And Jesus said, Paul, we have many places to go and many churches to speak to. This is not the end. You're going to stand before kings. Can you imagine how everything would change? He said, the Lord rescued me from the jaws of the lion. I don't think he was talking about physical lions necessarily. I think he was talking about the lions that eat at our hearts, the fear, the anxiety, the worry. He said he rescued me and he will yet rescue me. That's faith. Faith says, yeah, he's been good to me. He will be good to me. He has provided for me. He will provide for me. He's gone to bat for me. He will go to bat for me. We actually have to go the other way, and when we say it, the feelings follow. But if you say, nothing good's going to happen to me, it's all going to be bad, and nothing's going to come out of this thing that's going to be any good at all, when you declare those things, your feelings will follow. And those feelings will seem like they take on a life of their own. We say, oftentimes, what we believe. So I'll meet with someone who's struggling with fear and anxiety and worry and depression, and within minutes, without even trying, it comes out of their mouth, and they tell me what they're believing. And if I can convince them, if I can take their own words and say, now here's what you're saying, but this is what the Bible says, or what did Jesus say about that? Or even ask them to get before the Lord afresh and pray about it to see what he'll say in the present tense. That's what we declare. That's what we set our faith into. That's what we say aloud with our mouth. And when we do that, our feelings follow. Always. Not sometimes. Always. It's simple, but it isn't easy. It takes discipline. You have to get your want to in place. You have to be so tired of the battle of fear, so tired of sleepless nights, so tired of what it does to your joints and your muscles and your back, that you say, that's it, I'm going to change. I'm going to change how I think. I'm going to change how I feel by changing what I say and how I think. Somebody has to do this. God can't do it for me. My spouse can't do it for me. My best friend can't do it for me. My pastor can't do it for me. The police can't do it for me. The only person who can change the way I think is me. David had a lifelong battle with it. He was super creative. He was a man of vision. He was a man of faith. And therefore, that great strength, the weakness that comes with that strength, is a problem with fear, anxiety, and depression. He battled all of it and wrote about it. That's how we know. The Apostle Paul was a great visionary and a great man of faith. So he often wrote to his churches saying, about his struggles with fear. He was honest about it. I've had a lifelong battle with fear and depression and anxiety. Not once in a while, every day, and sometimes almost all day, I have to get a hold of my thoughts and discipline and bring them back where they should be. Otherwise, I'd never get anything done. In part because I have a very powerful imagination. I'm also visionary and I'm a person of faith. That's the strengths. The weakness that comes with that, I just have had a lifelong battle of fear. In fact, all my siblings all have the same fear. My dad died when I was a year old, and my mother raised us. She had no money, and she raised us. She had a lot of fears, and we were just created, our whole home was just constant fear. Constant. Don't go out. You can't go out and play there. You can't do this. You can't do that. She just couldn't stand the thought of it, something happening to us. She was run ragged with fears all her life. But all my siblings all have issues with fears, just like I do. The difference is I keep going. I don't want to let any of those things stop me. I keep getting on airplanes. I keep going. But before I do, I always have this whole thing of a battle where I have to decide what's going to govern my life. Is it going to be the will of God, or is it going to be these feelings? Is this helpful? Okay. Amen.